The sound of rushing water echoed through the valley, wild and merciless, as if nature itself was testing the strength of those who wandered too close. On that day, a young woman in a designer hiking jacket stood at the edge of the icy Cascade River in Washington state, laughing nervously as her friend took a photo, but her laughter vanished in an instant when her foot slipped on the slick, moss-covered rock. Her arms flailed, her scream drowned by the roar of the river. No one knew that a single father, worn down by life yet strong in spirit, would be there at that exact second. No one knew that this man, with mud on his boots and calluses on his hands, would change her life forever. And neither of them knew that from that terrifying slip into the water, a love story powerful enough to heal two broken souls would begin. The Cascade Mountains were alive with spring. Snowmelt rushed down into streams and rivers, painting the land with a restless energy. James Carter, a 34-year-old handyman, carried a tool bag on his shoulder as he made his way down a side trail. He often worked odd jobs at cabins tucked deep in the mountains, and today was no different. He had left his 9-year-old daughter, Emma, with a neighbor, promising her that he would be back before dinner. Life as a single dad hadn't been easy since his wife left years ago, but James wore his struggles like armor, quiet, enduring, and steady. As he walked, he thought about the bills stacking on his kitchen counter and the worn-out boots Emma desperately needed replaced. His mind was so lost in numbers and worry that he almost didn't hear the sudden shriek over the roar of the river. His instincts sharpened instantly. He dropped his bag, sprinted toward the sound, and caught sight of a woman tumbling, her hands clawing at the slick rocks, her eyes wide with panic. James didn't hesitate. He launched himself onto the slippery edge, his strong arms stretching forward just as she slipped again. Their hands met, hers soft and manicured, his rough and scarred. He pulled with everything he had, dragging her against his chest, away from the current that could have swallowed her whole. She clung to him, trembling, water dripping down her hair and jacket, breathless with shock. For a moment, they didn't speak. The forest held its breath, and the only sound was the pounding of their hearts. She looked up into his face, her eyes full of disbelief and gratitude. "You saved me," she whispered. James shook his head slightly, his voice steady. "Just glad I was here." Neither of them knew that this rescue would bind their lives in ways they couldn't yet imagine. Her name was Claire Whitmore, though she didn't tell him right away. All she managed was, "Thank you. I could have died." James gave her his jacket, even though he knew he'd be cold without it. Claire's teeth chattered as she pulled it around herself, realizing it smelled faintly of pine and laundry soap, the kind of scent that carried home and comfort. James helped her back to the trail, walking slowly to make sure she didn't slip again. He asked if she had anyone with her, and she explained her friend had gone ahead, not realizing she had paused by the river. Embarrassment colored her cheeks as she admitted she'd wanted a perfect picture for her social media. "Guess it almost cost me my life," she murmured. James didn't judge her. He simply said, "Pictures can wait. Life can't." When her friend finally returned, flustered and worried, Claire introduced James only as the man who saved me. James nodded politely, already preparing to walk away. He had no idea who she truly was, one of the youngest CEOs in London's tech industry, on a short hiking retreat before a major deal. To him, she was just a shaken woman who needed help. But Claire wasn't ready to let him go. Something in his presence, the steady way he had caught her, the unshakable calm in his eyes, lingered in her chest. Before he disappeared back down the path, she called after him. "Wait! At least, tell me your name." James hesitated, then offered a faint smile. "James Carter." She repeated it softly, as if committing it to memory. And just like that, a seed was planted, fragile, yet destined to grow. Claire couldn't stop thinking about him. That night back at the cozy lodge where she was staying, Her mind replayed the moment over and over. The slip, the rush of water, his hand pulling her back. She sat in front of the fireplace, sipping tea, her expensive phone buzzing with emails about mergers and investors. But instead of focusing on her board meetings in London, she was haunted by the warmth of a stranger's jacket around her shoulders. She had spent years in polished boardrooms and glossy offices, surrounded by people who wanted something from her approval, her signature, her power. But James had wanted nothing. He hadn't even asked her name. That quiet indifference struck her harder than she expected. For the first time in years, she wondered what it might be like to be seen simply as a woman, not a CEO, not a symbol of success. Meanwhile, James returned home to Emma, who greeted him with an eager hug and questions about his day. He tucked her into bed that night, hiding his exhaustion and the constant ache of responsibility. He didn't tell her about the woman at the river. Why would he? People like her didn't cross into his world twice. Or so he thought. But fate has a way of breaking down barriers. While James drifted to sleep on his worn-out couch, Claire stared at her phone screen, searching James Carter Handyman Cascade Valley. She wasn't ready to let the man who saved her vanish, and though she didn't know it yet, that decision would change both their lives forever. The next morning, Claire canceled her last scheduled hike and drove into town. The small Cascade Valley community was nothing like London. Rustic diners, hardware stores with faded signs, and children riding bikes without fear. She walked into the diner, hoping to ask about James. People noticed her polished outfit and curious accent, but when she described him, the waitress smiled knowingly. "You must mean James Carter. Hardest working man around here. Always helping folks fix their roofs or patch their barns." The waitress leaned closer. "Single dad, too. Good man." Claire felt something stir in her chest. She scribbled down directions to his house and hesitated at the thought of showing up uninvited. But she couldn't shake the need to thank him properly. James, meanwhile, was on his knees fixing a neighbor's porch railing when Claire's sleek rental car pulled into his gravel driveway. Emma peeked out the window, curiosity lighting up her little face. When Claire stepped out, dressed more casually than before, but still radiating elegance, James blinked in surprise. "I hope you don't mind me coming," she said softly. "I just couldn't leave without saying thank you again." James wiped his hands on his jeans, his guard rising. He wasn't used to visitors, especially not women like her. "No need for that," he said. But when Emma shyly peeked out and Claire smiled warmly at her, something in his defenses began to crack. Emma, curious and friendly, tugged on James's sleeve. "Daddy? Who is she?" James introduced Claire simply as, "A lady I helped yesterday." Claire knelt down to Emma's level, her eyes softening. "Well, then I should thank you too because your daddy is a real hero." Emma giggled, instantly liking her. James felt uneasy. He didn't want Emma getting attached to someone who had vanished back to her world soon enough. But Claire insisted on treating them both to lunch in town. Against his better judgment, James agreed. At the diner, they sat together in a booth, the clinking of silverware and chatter of locals filling the air. Claire found herself fascinated by James's humility. He talked little about himself, focusing instead on Emma, who animatedly described her favorite books and how her dad made the best pancakes. Claire listened intently, her heart warming. It had been years since she'd shared such a simple, unpolished moment. When Claire excused herself to the restroom, the waitress leaned over to James. "That woman likes you, James. Don't push her away so fast." James frowned, shaking his head. "She doesn't belong here." But deep down, something inside him wondered if maybe, just maybe, fate had brought her into his world for a reason. As the days passed, Claire found reasons to linger in Cascade Valley. Her friend returned to London, but Claire extended her stay, telling her board she needed more time before negotiations. In truth, she was drawn back to James and Emma again and again. James tried to resist. He told himself Claire's world was one of private jets, expensive cars, and penthouse apartments, while his was leaky roofs and second-hand clothes. But every time she showed up, bringing Emma a storybook, offering to help with repairs, or just sitting on the porch sipping coffee, his walls weakened. One evening, after Emma had gone to bed, Claire stayed a little longer. They sat on the porch, the mountain air cool around them, stars bright overhead. "You know," Claire said softly, "in my world, people never slow down. Everything is about the next deal, the next goal. But here, I feel like I can breathe." James studied her, the light from the porch lamp catching the honesty in her eyes. "Maybe that's because here, it's not about what you have. It's about who you are." For a moment, their gazes held, and the air between them shifted. Neither of them spoke the feelings blooming quietly in their hearts, but both knew something had changed. Their fragile bond deepened in the weeks that followed. Claire became a regular presence in Emma's life, helping with school projects and even teaching her how to bake cookies from scratch. Emma adored her, calling her Miss Claire and running to the door whenever she visited. James, though, remained cautious. He had been abandoned once before, left to raise Emma alone when his wife couldn't handle the struggles of their modest life. He couldn't risk Emma's heart breaking again. But every time he saw Claire laughing with Emma or rolling up her sleeves to help him fix a fence, he wondered if she was different. One afternoon, Claire invited them both on a picnic by the lake. They sat on a blanket, Emma skipping stones while James and Claire talked. "You know," Claire admitted, "my life looks perfect on paper, but it's lonely. I've spent years building a company, but I forgot what it feels like to belong." James looked at her quietly, his voice steady but gentle. "You do belong. At least, here with us you do." Claire's chest tightened at his words. She realized then that what she felt for James wasn't just gratitude. It was something deeper, something that scared her and thrilled her at the same time. Claire's time in Cascade Valley stretched longer than she had planned, but the outside world was beginning to notice her absence. Her board members grew restless, emails piled up, and investors demanded her presence back in London. Still, she delayed, torn between duty and desire. One night, after a call with her assistant that ended in frustration, she sat on James's porch with her head in her hands. James noticed the tension in her shoulders. "Rough night?" he asked. Claire sighed. "It's like I'm living two lives. One where I'm CEO of Whitmore Tech, and one where I'm just Claire. And I don't know which one is real anymore." James leaned against the railing, choosing his words carefully. "Maybe both are real, but you've got to figure out which one makes you happy. Because at the end of the day, all the titles and money don't matter if you're alone." His words struck her like a chord she hadn't known she needed to hear. She looked at him, her heart pulling toward a choice she wasn't ready to make. And James, though he wouldn't admit it, feared the day she would have to leave. The inevitable came sooner than they expected. Claire received an urgent call. A critical investor was threatening to withdraw unless she returned to London immediately. She tried to explain, but James understood. He had always known she couldn't stay forever. On her last night in Cascade Valley, she tucked Emma into bed with a kiss on the forehead. Emma clung to her. "Will you come back, Miss Claire?" Claire's throat tightened. "I'll try, sweetheart." She looked at James, her eyes pleading with something unspoken. Outside, under the stars, Claire and James stood facing each other. "Thank you for everything," she whispered. "For saving me, for this." James's jaw tightened. "Safe travels, Claire." He didn't let himself say more, afraid that if he did, his heart would betray him. Claire drove away at dawn, tears blurring her vision. In London, skyscrapers and conference rooms awaited her, but for the first time in her life, Success felt hollow. Weeks passed. James returned to his routine, throwing himself into work and caring for Emma. But something had shifted. He found himself glancing at the porch, half expecting Claire's car to pull in. Emma asked about her constantly, and James had no answers. Meanwhile, Claire buried herself in board meetings and presentations, but her thoughts kept drifting back to Cascade Valley. She missed the simplicity of mornings with James, the warmth of Emma's laughter, the peace of sitting by the lake. She realized with startling clarity that no amount of business triumphs could fill the void in her heart. One evening, after another grueling day, Claire sat alone in her London penthouse. The city lights sparkled below, but they felt cold and distant. She whispered to herself, "What am I doing?" I had happiness in my hands, and I let it go. The decision crystallized then and there. She had to return. Claire booked a flight back to the U.S. without telling anyone. She arrived in Cascade Valley unannounced, her heart pounding as she drove the familiar road to James's house. Emma was playing in the yard when she spotted her. With a squeal of delight, Emma ran into her arms. James stepped onto the porch, shock written on his face. "Claire," she nodded, tears in her eyes. "I couldn't stay away. I don't want boardrooms and skyscrapers if it means losing this, losing you." James hesitated, torn between hope and caution. "Are you sure? This life isn't easy, Claire. It's messy. It's hard." Claire cut him off, her voice steady. "I don't want easy. I want real. And you, James, you and Emma, you're real." For the first time, James let himself believe. He stepped forward, pulling her into his arms. And as Emma clapped and laughed beside them, it felt like a family was finally being born. Life didn't magically become perfect overnight. Claire struggled to adjust from her polished world to James's modest one. She burned dinner more than once, tripped over tools in his shed, and had to learn that budgeting wasn't a word she could ignore. But she was determined. Emma, thrilled to have Claire around, became her little shadow. Together they cooked, read stories, and planted flowers in the yard. James watched, his heart swelling with gratitude and fear. Gratitude because Claire brought light into their lives, and fear because he couldn't shake the thought she might leave again. One evening, as they washed dishes side by side, James admitted, "I don't know how to trust this, Claire. People don't usually stay." Claire dried her hands and turned to him, her gaze unwavering. "Then let me prove to you that I'm not going anywhere." And slowly, day by day, she did. News of Claire's new life spread fast. Some locals were curious, others skeptical. A wealthy London CEO living in Cascade Valley? It sounded like gossip too wild to be true. But Claire didn't care. She walked through town proudly with James and Emma, holding their hands, unbothered by the stares. Still, her board back in London wasn't pleased. They sent emails, called relentlessly, and even threatened to oust her from her company. Claire faced a choice: return to her empire or step aside. After weeks of sleepless nights, she chose the latter. In a video call with her board, she said calmly, "I built this company from the ground up, but it's time for me to step down. I want a life that's more than balance sheets and boardrooms." Shock rippled across the call, but Claire felt free. When she told James, he stared at her in disbelief. "You gave up everything?" Claire smiled softly. "No, I finally chose everything that matters." With her career behind her, Claire poured her energy into Cascade Valley. She started small, volunteering at Emma's school, helping organize community events, and even teaching a class on entrepreneurship at the local center. People began to see she wasn't just a visitor, she was one of them. James, though still cautious, grew more comfortable letting his guard down. He shared more of his past with Claire, the heartbreak of his failed marriage, the nights he spent wondering if he was enough for Emma. Claire listened without judgment, her hand steady in his. Emma blossomed with Claire in her life. She laughed more, dreamed bigger, and began to call her Aunt Claire, though everyone knew she was more than that. And though neither James nor Claire had spoken the words aloud yet, love was blooming openly now, undeniable and strong. One evening, James surprised Claire by taking her on a hike back to the Cascade River, the very place where they had first met. They stood together on the rocks, the memory of that day rushing back. "You know," James said, his voice thick, "I've been scared every day since that you'd slip away again. Not into the river, but out of our lives." Claire reached for his hand. "Then hold on to me, James, because I'm not letting go." He kissed her then, the river roaring beside them, sealing their promise not just with words, but with something deeper. From that moment, their love wasn't a fragile hope anymore. It was a commitment, messy, imperfect, but real. But love always faces tests. One winter, James's work slowed to a crawl, and bills began piling up again. Pride kept him from asking Claire for help. She, meanwhile, wrestled with guilt, knowing she had resources that could ease his burden, but fearing she'd insult his independence. Tension grew between them, small arguments sparking over money, over schedules, over how to raise Emma. One night, James snapped, "You don't understand what it's like to struggle." The words hung heavy in the air. Claire's eyes filled with tears. "And you don't understand what it is like to give everything up for love." They spent days barely speaking, the silence painful. But eventually, James realized his pride was hurting not just him, but Emma and Claire too. He apologized, admitting, "I'm just afraid you'll see how broken I really am." Claire cupped his face, whispering, "You're not broken, James. You're the strongest man I know, and I love you." Spring brought new beginnings. Claire suggested starting a small family business together, combining her business skills with his handyman expertise. At first, James resisted, but eventually he saw the potential. Together they launched Carter and Whitmore Home Services, offering everything from repairs to renovations. The community rallied behind them. Neighbors who once doubted Claire now admired her dedication. Jobs poured in, and slowly, James's financial burdens eased. For the first time in years, he felt hopeful about the future. Emma loved being part of it too, proudly handing out flyers at school and telling everyone her daddy and Miss Claire could fix anything. Their little business wasn't just about money. It was about building a life together. And with each nail hammered and each wall painted, James and Claire built more than homes. They built trust, partnership, and a foundation for the family they were becoming. One summer evening, James took Claire and Emma to a fair in town. They rode the Ferris wheel, ate cotton candy, and laughed until their sides ached. At the top of the Ferris wheel, James looked out at the lights below, then turned to Claire. "I've been thinking," he said quietly, "about us, about Emma, about forever." Claire's heart skipped. "Forever?" James nodded, his rough hand finding hers. "I don't have much to give, but I want to give you everything I am." Tears filled Claire's eyes as she whispered, "That's all I've ever wanted." Emma, oblivious to the moment, giggled beside them. But in that instant, the three of them felt like a family in the truest sense. Months later, James proposed in the most James way possible, simple, honest, and heartfelt. He carved a small wooden box himself, placing inside a modest ring he had saved up for. On a quiet evening, he knelt on the porch where so many of their conversations had begun. "Claire Whitmore," he said, his voice trembling, "you turned my world upside down the day you slipped into that river. And every day since, you've made me believe in love again. Will you marry me?" Claire covered her mouth, tears streaming. "Yes. 1,000 times yes." Emma, who had been hiding around the corner, squealed and ran into their arms. "Does this mean you'll be my mom now?" she asked innocently. Claire hugged her tightly. "Yes, sweetheart, if you'll have me." The wedding was small but perfect. In a meadow near the river, surrounded by wildflowers and close friends, James and Claire exchanged vows. Claire wore a simple gown, her hair loose in the mountain breeze. James wore his best suit, Emma standing proudly as flower girl. As they spoke their vows, both of them knew the journey hadn't been easy. They had faced doubts, distance, and fear. But standing there, hand in hand, they knew it had all been worth it. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, the crowd cheered and Emma jumped with joy. James kissed Claire with the passion of a man who had waited his whole life for this moment. It wasn't a fairy tale wedding, it was something better. It was real. Married life brought new challenges but also new joys. Together they balanced their growing business, Emma's school, and the ups and downs of family life. There were arguments and compromises, laughter and tears. But through it all, love was their anchor. Claire embraced the role of stepmother, helping Emma with homework, cheering at her soccer games, and tucking her in at night. Emma, in turn, flourished, her once quiet world now filled with stability and love. James, though still a humble handyman at heart, felt like the richest man alive, not because of money, but because he finally had the family he'd dreamed of. And Claire, once a powerful CEO, found more fulfillment in bedtime stories and Sunday dinners than she ever had in boardrooms. Years later, standing once again by the Cascade River, James, Claire, and Emma, now a teenager, looked out at the rushing water. "Hard to believe this is where it all started," Claire said softly, squeezing James's hand. Emma rolled her eyes with a smile. "If you hadn't saved her dad, none of this would have happened." James chuckled. "Guess sometimes life changes in a single moment." Claire leaned her head on his shoulder. It wasn't just a moment. It was destiny. As the river roared beside them, the three of them stood together. Proof that love can rise from the most unexpected places. That two broken lives can come together and create something unshakable, something beautiful. A family. Sometimes the greatest love stories don't begin in ballrooms or boardrooms, but in the unlikeliest of places. All it takes is one moment, one act of courage to change everything. Love, after all, isn't about where you come from, it's about where you choose to belong.